The year was 1889, and the world for Cora Prescott was a cage. It was not a cage of iron bars, but one of wood and shade, constructed by her own father on the edge of a sun-scorched expanse of Arizona territory. It was a screened-in porch, wide and long, attached to the side of their dilapidated homestead. To a traveler on the distant trail, it might have looked like a luxury, a place to catch a breeze. But to Cora, it was a display case. From the age of 7, after the fire that had taken her mother and painted half her face with a terrible puckered canvas of scars, this porch had become her entire existence. Her father, Amos Prescott, was a man whose grief had long ago curdled into a venomous sort of opportunism. He had seen the way people stared at his daughter, the morbid curiosity that twisted their faces, and he had found a way to coin it. He called her his miraculous survivor, a testament to God's will. But the whispers in the nearest settlement of dusty, wind-beaten shacks called her the Prescott Monster. Amos charged 2 bits for a look, a nickel more if they wanted to hear the fabricated, heroic tale of her survival, a tale in which he always played the central, selfless part. Cora's days bled into one another in a slow, monotonous rhythm of humiliation. She would sit in a wooden chair placed in the center of the porch, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on a particular knot in the floorboards. She had learned to retreat so far inside herself that the leering eyes and hushed gasps became a distant hum, like flies buzzing against the screen. She felt their gazes crawl over the roped, discolored skin that pulled at the corner of her left eye and erased her eyebrow, the scar tissue that melted her cheek into her jawline. The other half of her face was as it had been, untouched, a cruel reminder of the girl she was supposed to be. It was this stark division that seemed to fascinate them most, the perfect and the ruined, side by side. Her life was a tapestry of silence, woven with the threads of her father's booming voice and the desert wind that howled like a thing grieving. She had forgotten the sound of her own voice, having had no one to speak to and nothing to say. Her mother was a ghost, a scent of lavender and a half-remembered lullaby. Her father was a warden. The vast, indifferent landscape of rock and cactus was the wall of her prison. Hope was a foreign country she had never visited. She was 20 years old and had already accepted that this was the entirety of her life, to be looked at but never seen. Then, one sweltering afternoon when the heat made the air shimmer and dance, a new figure appeared on the horizon. He was not in a wagon or on a fine horse like the men who sometimes came from the towns. He walked, leading a weary-looking dun mare that favored its right foreleg. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace that spoke not of leisure, but of a long journey. As he drew closer, Cora could see he was a Navajo man, tall and lean, with hair as black as a raven's wing tied back with a simple leather thong. He wore practical, worn clothing and carried his belongings in a roll on his back. There was a stillness about him, a stark contrast to the jittery, brutish energy of the men her father usually entertained. Amos spotted him from the yard, where he was mending a harness. His eyes, small and greedy, lit up. Another customer, and one who looked like he had traveled far. Desperate men paid well for a distraction. "Stay put," he barked towards the porch, an unnecessary command. Cora had not left the porch in 13 years. She watched as her father strode out to meet the stranger, his posture puffing up with false welcome. She could not hear their words, only the murmur of voices carried on the wind. The Navajo man gestured to his horse's leg, then to the well. It was a request for water, for rest. Amos nodded enthusiastically, a predator sensing a trapped animal. He led the man and his horse into the dusty yard. After the horse was tended to, given water and a place in the shade of the lean-to, Amos turned and gestured grandly toward the porch. He was beginning his sales pitch. Cora braced herself, her stomach twisting into a familiar, cold knot. She lowered her head, finding the comforting imperfection of the knot in the floor. She heard their footsteps approaching, the heavy stomp of her father and the softer, almost silent tread of the stranger. They stopped just outside the screen door. "A true marvel of the Lord's mysterious ways," Amos began, his voice taking on its practiced, showman's tone. "Caught in a terrible blaze that took her sainted mother, yet she was spared, a living miracle." He unlocked the screen door with a flourish. "2 bits, sir, to witness proof that the will to live is stronger than any fire." There was a long silence. Cora did not look up. She felt the weight of a gaze upon her, but it was different. It lacked the usual morbid pressure. It was quiet, steady, and held no discernible judgment. It was merely watchful. "I have no money for such things," the man's voice said. It was a low, calm baritone, like the rumble of distant thunder. "I only asked for water." "Well, water ain't free out here," Amos countered, his voice losing its theatricality and gaining a hard edge. "But a bit of work might pay for it. And for the look you're already taken." Cora risked a glance, peering through the curtain of her hair. The Navajo man was not looking at her scars. He was looking at her eyes. For a heart-stopping second, their gazes met. His eyes were dark and deep, and in them she saw not pity, not disgust, but a profound and weary quiet, as if he recognized the landscape of her soul. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, a simple acknowledgement of her presence, of her as a person. Then he turned his attention back to her father. "The corral fence is broken on the west side," the man, who later introduced himself as Bidziel, stated. "It was not a question. I will fix it, for the water and for a place for my horse to heal for 2 days." Amos, surprised by the man's directness and disinterest in his prized spectacle, hesitated for a moment before agreeing. A mended fence was worth more than 2 bits. "Fine," he grumbled. 2 days. But you keep to the yard. Don't be getting ideas." Bidziel simply nodded again and walked away toward the dilapidated corral, leaving Amos sputtering and Cora with a strange, unfamiliar flutter in her chest. It was the first time anyone had looked at her and then chosen to look away, not in revulsion, but as a matter of respect. It was a small thing, a tiny seed of something she could not name, planted in the barren soil of her existence. For the next 2 days, Cora's world shifted on its axis. Her routine was the same: the chair, the silence, the shame, but now there was a new element: Bidziel. He worked with a silent, efficient grace, his hands skilled and sure as he replaced the rotting fence posts. He moved as if he were a part of the land itself, accustomed to its heat and its demands. He never once glanced towards the porch. It was this deliberate ignoring of her that felt more profound than any kindness she had ever been shown. He was refusing to participate in her humiliation. Amos watched him with suspicion, annoyed that his new visitor was more interested in labor than in his daughter's disfigurement. He would stomp around the yard, offering unsolicited advice that Bidziel would receive with a quiet nod before continuing his work in his own, clearly superior way. From her cage, Cora watched everything. She watched the way his muscles moved under his shirt as he swung the post maul. She watched him stop to give his mare water, murmuring to the animal in his own language, his voice gentle. On the evening of the first day, she saw him sitting by a small fire he'd built, carving a piece of cottonwood root with a small knife. He was creating something, bringing a shape out of the wood with patient, deliberate cuts. It was the opposite of the destructive force that had shaped her. The next morning, when her father went inside the house to get his jug of corn liquor, Cora saw Bidziel walk near the porch. He did not approach the door, but he stopped by a wilting desert marigold that struggled in the hard-packed dirt. He knelt, using his canteen to pour a small amount of precious water at its base. Then he looked up, his eyes finding hers through the screen. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze for a moment before rising and returning to his work. That afternoon, Amos went into town for supplies, a rare occurrence that left Cora with a few hours of reprieve from his presence. The silence he left behind was different, lighter. For a long while there was only the sound of the wind and the rhythmic thud of Bidziel's hammer. Then the sound stopped. Cora looked up to see him standing outside the screen door. He was holding something in his hand. "The fence is finished," he said, his voice low. Cora stared at him, her heart pounding against her ribs. She had not spoken to another soul besides her father in years. Her throat felt tight, rusted shut. He did not try to open the door. He held out his hand. In his palm lay the small carving she had seen him working on. It was a bird, its wings slightly spread as if about to take flight. The detail was exquisite, each tiny feather etched with care. "For you," he said. He did not say why. He did not offer condolences for her state or platitudes about her spirit. He simply offered a gift. Slowly, hesitantly, Cora rose from her chair and walked to the door. Her hands trembled as she pushed it open just enough to reach out. The screen door had not been opened by her in a decade. Her fingers brushed against his as she took the small wooden bird. His skin was warm and calloused, the touch sending a jolt through her that was so foreign it was almost painful. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were raspy, alien in her own ears. Bidziel nodded, his expression unreadable but calm. He looked at her whole face, and for the first time she did not flinch away. He was not staring at the ruin. He was looking at her, the person holding the bird. "It is a wren," he said. "They sing, even when they are small and the world is large." He then turned and walked back to his horse without another word, leaving Cora standing in the open doorway, the wooden bird clutched in her hand. It felt impossibly heavy, a weight of kindness she was unaccustomed to bearing. She looked from the wren to the vast, empty desert beyond the fence he had mended. For the first time she saw not just the boundary of her prison, but the line of a horizon, a place one could travel to. The wren in her hand did not sing, but in the ringing silence of her mind, Cora thought she could almost hear it. The fragile peace was shattered when her father returned that evening. He was not alone. With him were 3 men, their faces flushed with drink and the cruelty of boredom. They were miners, by the look of their calloused hands and grime-stained clothes. Amos was swaggering, clearly proud of the business he had drummed up. "Told you boys it was a sight to see," he boomed, clapping one of them on the back. "Right this way, gentlemen. A genuine marvel." Bidziel, who had been checking his horse's leg, straightened up, his body going tense. He watched the group approach, his hand resting lightly on the handle of the knife at his belt. His eyes were flinty, missing the calm they had held before. Cora retreated to her chair, the little wooden bird hidden in the pocket of her dress. The old, cold dread washed over her, colder and more bitter than ever before, because now she had a memory of something different, a moment of quiet dignity to contrast with this gross violation. The men crowded at the screen door, their foul breath and loud jeers polluting the evening air. They were worse than the usual gawkers. Their eyes were not just curious, they were predatory. "Well, look at that," one of them sneered, his gaze roaming over Cora's scars. "He weren't lying. Half angel, half devil." "I'd like to see it up close," another said, rattling the door handle. "Let us in, Prescott. We paid for the full show." Amos, ever the coward, began to look nervous. He had wanted their money, but he was losing control of the situation. "Now, hold on, boys. The rules are, you look from here." "Rules just changed," the first man said, and shoved Amos aside. But before he could touch the latch, Bidziel was there. He moved with a speed that was startling, placing himself between the miners and the porch door. He did not draw his knife. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable object. "That is far enough," Bidziel said, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable threat. The miner laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "And who are you to stop me? Her Indian protector." He shoved at Bidziel's chest. It was like shoving a stone wall. Bidziel did not move an inch. He just looked at the man, his dark eyes filled with a terrifying resolve. "She is not a thing for your amusement. Leave this place." Amos, seeing his profits and his authority evaporating, finally found his voice. "Now see here, you have no say in this. She is my daughter. This is my property." He pointed a shaking finger at Cora. "She does what I say." The declaration hung in the air, ugly and raw. It stripped away the last pretense of fatherly care, laying bare the truth of their relationship. Cora was property, an object, a thing to be sold. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. But then, something else rose up in their wake, a hot, surging anger that burned brighter than any fire. The first miner, enraged by Bidzeel's defiance, swung a clumsy fist. Bidzeel deflected it easily, stepping aside and using the man's own momentum to send him stumbling into one of his companions. The third man lunged, and the yard erupted into a chaotic scuffle. Bidzeel was outnumbered, but he was quicker and smarter, using his knowledge of leverage and balance to hold his own against the drunken brutes. Cora watched, frozen in horror, as one of the men landed a glancing blow on Bidzeel's jaw. He grunted, shaking his head to clear it. They were going to hurt him. They were going to hurt this man, the only person who had ever looked at her with kindness, and it was because of her. Her father cowered near the side of the house, useless. In that moment, the cage her father had built and the prison she had constructed in her own mind shattered. The instinct for survival, the will that Amos had so often preached about, finally ignited within her. It was not a will to endure, but a will to act. With a cry that was torn from the deepest parts of her soul, a sound of 13 years of repressed rage and sorrow, Cora burst through the screen door. The wood splintered around the latch. She grabbed the first thing she could find, a heavy iron skillet left near the outdoor hearth. It was heavy in her hands, a solid weight of purpose. The men turned, stunned by her sudden appearance. They had expected a passive, broken creature. They were not prepared for the fury in her one good eye, the snarl that twisted her lips, scarred and unscarred alike. "Get away from him," she screamed, her voice a raw, powerful thing. She swung the skillet with all her might, catching the first miner across the shoulder. He howled in pain and surprise, staggering back. The distraction was all Bidzeel needed. He delivered a sharp, disabling blow to the second man's gut, doubling him over. The third man, his drunken courage failing him, looked from the fierce, skillet-wielding girl to the grimly determined Navajo man, then to his whimpering friends. He let out a curse, turned, and fled into the twilight. His companions were quick to follow, scrambling over each other in their haste to escape this place that had turned so suddenly hostile. Silence descended, broken only by the panting breaths of Cora and Bidzeel and the fading footsteps of the routed miners. Cora stood in the middle of the yard, the heavy skillet still held aloft, her body trembling with adrenaline. She had done it. She had left the porch. She had fought back. Her father, Amos, stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What have you done?" he shrieked. "You foolish girl, you ruined everything." Cora slowly lowered the skillet. She looked at her father, at his contorted, fearful face, and she felt nothing. The power he had held over her for so long was gone, burned away in that single act of defiance. He was just a small, pathetic man. Bidzeel stepped to her side. He had a split lip and the beginning of a bruise on his cheek, but his eyes were clear. He looked at her not with shock, but with a deep, profound respect. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently take the iron skillet from her trembling hands, setting it down on the ground. "He is right," Cora said, her voice surprisingly steady. She was not looking at her father. She was looking at Bidzeel. "I have ruined everything." And a slow smile, the first true smile in over a decade, touched her lips. It was a beautiful, terrible thing, pulling at her scars, but it was hers. She had ruined the cage. She had ruined the prison. She was free. The aftermath was quiet, intimate. The desert night settled around them, cool and filled with the scent of sagebrush. Amos had retreated into the house, slamming the door behind him, his angry muttering audible even through the thick adobe walls. He was irrelevant now, a ghost haunting a house that was no longer her home. Cora led Bidziel to the well, her movements still feeling new and strange in the open air. She drew up a bucket of cool water. She dipped a strip of clean cloth torn from her petticoat into the water and, with a hand that shook only slightly, reached up to gently clean the cut on his lip. He stood perfectly still, allowing the intimacy of the gesture, his dark eyes never leaving her face. The lamplight from the house cast shifting shadows, but in his gaze there was only a steady light. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that soothed the last of her trembling. "They would have hurt you," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "It was because of me." "I was not hurt because of you," he corrected gently. "I was hurt because of them, because of their ugliness. There is a difference." He paused, his gaze softening. "You were brave." Brave. No one had ever called her that. Miraculous, monstrous, pitiful, those were the words she knew. But brave, she had never thought of herself as having any capacity for courage. She had only ever endured. She lowered the cloth, looking down at her own hands. They were just hands, but they had held a weapon. They had defended someone. He reached out then, and his fingers gently touched the wooden bird in her pocket. "A wren," he said, his eyes holding hers. It found its voice. They stood like that for a long moment, the silence between them more meaningful than any words. In the shared space of the yard, under the vast, star-dusted sky, a new world was being born. The old one lay in ruins behind the splintered screen door. Finally, Bidziel stepped back, his expression turning serious. "His anger will be worse in the morning," he stated simply. "This place is no longer safe for you." Cora knew he was right. The fear she had felt for her father had been replaced by a clear-eyed understanding of his nature. He would never forgive her for breaking his most valuable possession, his control over her. "I cannot stay here," she said, the words tasting of freedom. "My horse is healed," Bidziel said. "I leave at sunrise. I travel north toward the mountains." He did not command or cajole. He simply stated a fact and let the invitation hang in the air between them. It was an offer of a path, not a promise of a destination. Cora looked at the dark shape of the homestead, the place of her long internment. Then she looked out at the desert, which no longer seemed like a barrier, but like an open door. The journey would be hard. The world was full of men like the miners, and her face would always draw stares, but the thought of facing it no longer terrified her. To face it with him, with this quiet, strong man who saw the songbird instead of the scars, seemed not just possible, but necessary. "Sections, I have nothing to take," she said, thinking of her sparse, empty room. "You have yourself," he answered, as if that were the most valuable possession in the world. "It is enough." And so, in the cool grey light just before dawn, Cora Prescott walked away from the only home she had ever known. She carried nothing but the clothes on her back, and the small wooden wren clutched tightly in her hand. She did not look back. Amos's shouts pursued them for a while, thin and pathetic on the morning air, but soon they were swallowed by the immense silence of the desert. They walked side by side, Bidziel leading his mare, and Cora matching his steady pace. The rising sun painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, and for the first time, Cora watched it not through the grid of a screen, but with an unobscured view. The land was still harsh, the journey ahead uncertain, but as she walked, she felt the wind on her face, on both sides of her face, and it did not feel like a mournful howl. It felt like a greeting. She glanced at Bidziel, at his strong, calm profile as he scanned the horizon. He had not offered her pity or salvation. He had offered her a road and the respect of walking it with her as an equal. He had not saved her from the cage. He had stood beside her while she found the strength to break it herself. She reached up and touched her scarred cheek. The skin was rough, a permanent reminder of the fire that had shaped her life. But it was not a mark of monstrosity. It was a testament. Not to her father's God, but to her own resilience. It was the map of a battle she had survived. Bidziel glanced over, his eyes meeting hers. He offered a small, quiet smile, and she returned it without hesitation. A home, she was beginning to understand, was not a place you were kept. It was a place you were seen, and walking into the vast, unknown wilderness beside the only man who had ever truly seen her, Cora felt like she was finally going home.